Hey guys, welcome to the Quiet Past historical channel. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Pull the blanket up. Maybe grab a warm drink if you have one nearby, because tonight we are going somewhere cold. I mean genuinely, deeply, cosmically cold. We're going to a place where your eyelashes freeze together when you blink, where the air is so cold it makes a faint crackling sound when you breathe it in, and where fish are sold at the outdoor market, standing upright, frozen solid, like little scaly statues. We're going to Yakutia. If you've never heard of it, don't worry. Most people haven't, and the people who live there would probably understand why. It's not exactly the kind of place that makes the travel brochure shortlist. There are no beaches, no cocktails with tiny umbrellas, no gentle Mediterranean breezes. What there is, in truly extraordinary abundance, is cold. Cold so total and so complete that it shapes everything: the food you eat, the house you build, the clothes on your back, the way you park your car, the way you bury your dead. Tonight, we are going to float through that world very slowly. We're going to start at the very beginning, with the geography, the silence, the staggering scale of it all, and then we'll drift through the ancient history of the people who decided, for reasons that will take a while to fully appreciate, that this was a perfectly reasonable place to make a home. We'll talk about the reindeer and the frozen fish and the roads built on bones and the underground diamond mines where the temperature drops to -55 even in the shaft. We'll talk about what happens to a human body, a car engine, and a concrete building when the ground beneath your feet has been frozen solid for thousands of years. And somewhere in there, as the story settles over you like a thick blanket of Siberian snow, you'll probably fall asleep. And that's exactly the point. So, let's begin. Yakutia. The official name is the Republic of Sakha, and it sits in the Russian Far East, which is one of those geographical labels that sounds mildly interesting until you look at a map and realize it means something almost incomprehensibly remote. We're talking about a region that covers more than 3 million square kilometers. To put that in perspective, it's roughly 12 times the size of the United Kingdom. It's bigger than any country in Europe. It's bigger than India. And yet, its total population hovers somewhere around 1 million people. 1 million people. In a space that large, that is what you might generously call elbow room. The Republic of Sakha stretches from the taiga, those endless, dark, frost-bitten forests of pine and larch and birch, all the way up to the Arctic Ocean. In the south, the landscape is dramatic mountain country, hard and cold and beautiful. In the north, it flattens into tundra, that rolling, treeless, wind-scoured plain that goes on so long it starts to feel like the earth forgot to stop. And right in the middle, in a broad river valley along the Lena River, you'll find Yakutsk, the capital city, and by more than one measure, the coldest major city in the world. Yakutsk, population about 355,000. Universities, shopping centers, theaters, a surprisingly active film industry, restaurants, traffic jams. A completely normal city in almost every respect, except for one small detail. The average temperature in January is minus 37 degrees Celsius. And on the worst days, it drops to minus 50 or lower. The record low for the city itself is minus 64. Minus 64. Just take a moment to sit with that. Minus 64 degrees Celsius is so far below anything most human beings ever experience that it becomes genuinely difficult to visualize. You know how minus 10 feels. You've probably done minus 20 if you've had a rough winter. Minus 30 starts to feel like a different planet. At minus 40, the scales actually meet Fahrenheit and Celsius read the same number, and both of them are terrible. At minus 50, rubber tires shatter like glass. At minus 64, the air itself becomes hostile in a way that's hard to fully describe. And yet there are people, hundreds of thousands of them, who get up in the morning, get dressed, walk outside, drive to work, drop their kids at school, and go about their day. Every single winter, without once treating it as particularly remarkable. That is the thing about Yakutia. The cold is not a catastrophe. It's not an emergency. It's just Tuesday. But we'll get to all of that. For now, let's settle in and talk about where this place actually is and why it gets so cold. The Lena River is one of the great rivers of Asia. It starts near Lake Baikal in southern Siberia and flows north for about 4,000 kilometers before emptying into the Arctic Ocean in a vast, icy delta. Yakutsk sits on the western bank of the Lena, roughly halfway along that journey, at a latitude of about 62 degrees north. For reference, that's roughly the same latitude as the southern tip of Norway. Oslo is at about 59 north, Yakutsk at 62. They should theoretically have roughly comparable climates. They do not. Oslo has an average January temperature of around minus 3. Yakutsk averages minus 37. The difference comes down to one critical factor, the ocean. Oslo is close to the sea. The sea stores heat and releases it slowly, moderating the temperature of the air above it. Yakutsk is about 725 kilometers from the Sea of Okhotsk, and those kilometers are not flat, easy distance. There are mountains in between. The mild maritime air simply never arrives. And without that moderating influence, the continental interior is free to do what continental interiors do in winter, which is get extraordinarily, mercilessly cold. It doesn't help that Yakutsk sits in a valley. Cold air is heavy. It sinks. It pools in low places. The Lena Valley is essentially a bowl that collects all the cold air from the surrounding highlands and holds it there, trapped, unable to escape. In winter, the city is locked inside a mass of frigid air that just sits and sits, getting colder as the weeks go by. And then there is the darkness. In January, Yakutsk gets fewer than 4 hours of daylight. The sun barely hauls itself above the horizon, casts a weak, pale light across the snow for a few hours, and disappears again. What little warmth there is in that light doesn't make a meaningful dent. The result is a cold so absolute and so sustained that it has reshaped the entire landscape, the entire economy, the entire culture of the region around it. Now, about 760 kilometers to the northeast of Yakutsk, connected by a road that we'll spend considerable time discussing later, there's a small village called Oymyakon. Population, somewhere around 500 people, depending on the year and how many of them have had enough. Oymyakon sits in a valley in the Oymyakon Highlands, and that valley is, if you can believe it, even better at trapping cold air than the Lena Valley. The surrounding mountains are high enough and close enough together that cold air flows in from all sides and can't get back out. It's essentially a natural cold trap. In January 1924, someone at the local weather station recorded a temperature of minus 71.2 degrees Celsius. There's a monument in the town commemorating this, because of course there is. That reading is, to this day, the lowest temperature ever officially recorded at a permanently inhabited settlement anywhere on Earth. For context, and this comparison never gets old, some nights on Mars are warmer than Oymyakon in January. You could, theoretically, walk outside naked in Oymyakon on a typical January afternoon and die within about 60 seconds. Maybe less. The name Oymyakon, wonderfully enough, comes from an even language word meaning something like unfrozen patch of water or place where fish spend the winter. This is because there's a geothermal hot spring nearby that never freezes. The hot spring is a local curiosity. The village around it is the coldest inhabited place on Earth. The contrast is very Yakutia. Here's a warm thing, and here's the cold thing that ate everything around it. So that's the geography. A republic the size of a continent, almost empty, sitting in the middle of the coldest landmass on Earth, getting colder every winter while the rest of the world gradually warms. The capital city is the coldest major city in the world. The most famous village is the coldest inhabited place in the world. The landscape is frozen solid down to depths of more than a kilometer in some places. And about 1 million people have decided that this is where they live. Let's talk about why. Ancient footsteps in frozen ground before we can understand the people of Yakutia today. We have to go back, way back, because the story of this land and its inhabitants is genuinely ancient, and it's not a simple one. The very first humans to live in the Yakutia region were not the Saka people. The indigenous group most closely associated with it today. The oldest inhabitants were hunter-gatherers and reindeer herders from Tungusic and Paleo-Siberian stocks. Groups like the Evenks and the Yukagirs, peoples who had been moving through these frozen landscapes for thousands of years, following the animals, surviving through intimate knowledge of a land that would kill the unprepared without hesitation. These were small groups of people, scattered thin across a vast geography, living lightly on the land in the only way the land permitted. They didn't build cities. They didn't plant crops. The permafrost wouldn't allow crops anyway, as we'll discuss at some length later. They moved with the seasons and the animals, and they built knowledge about which plants were medicinal, which rivers were safe to cross, which wind direction meant a storm was coming, how to read a reindeer's behavior when the temperature was dropping. The land was teacher, provider, and executioner all at once. The Saka people, who call themselves simply Saka, and whom the Russians would later call Yakuts, arrived later. The scholarly consensus is somewhat fuzzy on the timeline, which is probably appropriate for people who kept their history in oral form. Estimates range from as early as the 9th century to as late as the 16th, with most historians settling somewhere in between and noting there were probably several waves of migration rather than one tidy arrival. What's certain is where they came from, the south. Specifically, the region around Lake Baikal, that great inland sea in southern Siberia, the deepest lake in the world, old and cold and full of things found nowhere else. The ancestors of the Saka people were Turkic-speaking herders and pastoralists, a cultural background that sits oddly with their eventual home, because herding horses and cattle is not obviously what you'd expect from people who ended up in the coldest place on Earth. But that's what happened. Pushed northward, most likely by pressure from expanding Mongolic groups, including the Buryats, the Proto-Saka people migrated up the Lena River, out of the Malder South, and into the deepening cold of the subarctic interior. They brought their horses, they brought their cattle, they brought their language and their cosmology and their knowledge of the pastoral life. And then they arrived in Yakutia and discovered that they were going to have to completely rethink how to do almost everything. The transformation they underwent is remarkable. Over the centuries, the Saka people did not simply survive in their new environment. They adapted to it so thoroughly that the culture that emerged is deeply and distinctively Arctic, even though it has Turkic and Central Asian roots. They learned from the Evenks. They learned from the Yukagirs. They absorbed technologies, stories, spiritual practices, and survival strategies from the people who had been living there before them. The result was a culture unlike any other on Earth. Horse-breeding nomads who had somehow made a home above the permafrost, in temperatures that dropped to -70, building their knowledge of the frozen world into every aspect of their lives. One of the most distinctive aspects of Saka identity, even today, is the horse. The Yakutian horse is a remarkable creature. It's small and compact, with an extremely thick coat that grows in 2 dense layers. Its mane is so heavy it droops. It has wide, flat hooves that work like natural snowshoes. It can dig through snow to reach the grass beneath, which means it can feed itself through the winter without requiring humans to carry feed to it. It can survive temperatures that would kill virtually any other domestic horse on Earth. The Yakutian horse is, in a very real sense, what a horse looks like after it spends thousands of years in Yakutia. Evolution did its work, and the animal is genuinely extraordinary. For the Saka people, the horse was not just a practical animal. It was sacred. The horse appears throughout Saka spiritual life, in ritual, in ceremony, in the elaborate oral epic tradition. The hitching post outside a Saka home, the surge, was not just a place to tie up your horse. It was a world tree, a symbol of connection between earth and sky, a ritual object around which ceremonies were performed. You put up a surge, and you were planting your family in the world. You were saying, "We belong here." The Saka people also raised cattle, the Yakutian cattle, another cold adapted breed, and fished the rivers and hunted, and gradually over the centuries built a cultural life of considerable complexity in a landscape that offered almost no margin for error. Oral literature flourished. The Alonko, the great Yakut epic poem, was eventually recognized by UNESCO as a masterpiece of the oral and intangible heritage of humanity. It's a sprawling, multi-layered work of myth and hero tale and cosmology, passed from generation to generation by memory, performed by storytellers who could go on for hours and hours without repeating themselves. In a place where the winters are dark and long, and the cold keeps you indoors, you develop a rich inner culture, and the Saka people did exactly that. Shamanism was the religious foundation of traditional Saka life. The shamans, Eyi Oyun for the benevolent ones, Abahi Oyun for the darker practitioners, were intermediaries between the human world and the spirit world, which in Saka cosmology was elaborate and populated, and in constant interaction with the living. The land had spirits. The rivers had spirits. The fire had a spirit. There were spirits of the wind and the cold, spirits of illness, spirits of abundance. The shaman's job was to navigate this invisible landscape on behalf of the community, to negotiate, to appease, to heal. It's worth pausing on that for a moment. When you live in a place as extreme as Yakutia, the idea that the natural world is alive and requires attention and respect is not superstition. It's extremely practical. A person who treats the river as merely a physical feature and not as something that demands careful handling is more likely to fall through the ice. A person who believes the cold has a spirit, that the cold is, in some sense, a presence, is probably going to pay more careful attention to it. Animism and ecology turn out to have a lot in common. The Saka built their winter homes from wood and earth, using the very permafrost that made agriculture impossible as a kind of natural insulation. The traditional Yakut dwelling was called a balagan, a log structure with earthen walls and a flat roof that was also covered with sod and earth, designed to hold in as much warmth as possible. It was not large. You did not sprawl. You lived close together, generating body heat, burning whatever fuel you had, and waiting for the darkness to lift. This was the Yakutia of roughly the 10th through the 16th centuries, a cold, vast, deeply inhabited place, shaped by people who had chosen it and learned its ways over many generations. And then the Russians arrived. The Cossacks come calling the Russian entry into Siberia is one of the great imperial adventures of the early modern world, and it happened with a speed that is genuinely surprising. By the 1580s, Russian forces had begun pushing east of the Ural Mountains. By the 1630s, barely 50 years later, they had crossed the entire breadth of northern Asia and reached the Lena River, which is roughly the same distance as crossing North America from New York to Los Angeles. They did it through a combination of military force, ruthless pragmatic diplomacy, and one very powerful economic incentive: fur. Specifically, sable fur, which in the 17th century was essentially liquid gold. The fur trade was what funded the Russian Empire's expansion across Siberia, and the Cossack soldiers who led that expansion were not gentle or patient people. They were, in the main, tough, armed, acquisitive men who moved fast and dealt harshly with anyone who got in their way. They arrived in the Lena Valley in the 1620s, and the Saka people were not pleased to see them. There were conflicts, some of them serious. A Saka leader named Taijan, a powerful chief of the Kongalaski Saka, had a complicated relationship with the Russian newcomers, at turns hostile and pragmatic, eventually negotiating a kind of uneasy coexistence. The Russians wanted furs and taxes paid in furs, a system called yasak, and the indigenous people of Siberia were obligated to provide them. In 1632, a Cossack officer named Pyotr Beketov established a fort on the western bank of the Lena River. This fort, the Lensky Ostrog, would become Yakutsk. It was a small, rough garrison to begin with, a cluster of log buildings surrounded by a wooden palisade designed to be a base for fur collection and a waypoint for expeditions further into the east. Nobody was building it to last. Nobody was thinking about it in terms of a city. They were thinking about Sable, but it lasted. And as the decades and centuries passed, Yakutsk grew from a garrison into a town, from a town into a city. It became the administrative center of an enormous territory, a hub through which everything passed: prisoners and explorers and merchants and missionaries and scientists and Cossacks, heading further east to the Pacific coast and beyond. For the Saka people, the Russian arrival was a catastrophe of familiar dimensions. The initial period of Russian colonization saw the population drop by an estimated 70%, due to a combination of violence, introduced disease, and the disruption of traditional ways of life. This is the standard story of encounter between a technologically advanced colonial power and a pre-contact indigenous population. And it played out in Yakutia as it played out everywhere else, badly for the people who were already there. And yet, there is something that makes the Saka story slightly different from many other indigenous stories of Russian colonization, and that something is the cold. The Russians were, to put it gently, not eager to colonize Yakutia beyond a certain point. The climate was too extreme. The land was too difficult to farm. The distances were too vast. The Cossacks and the administrators and the fur traders used Yakutia, but they didn't exactly flock to it in the way that settlers flooded into, say, the American West. The cold was a deterrent. The permafrost was a deterrent. The darkness and the distance and the sheer unpleasantness of the place in winter were deterrents. This meant that the Saka people, while certainly losing autonomy and being subjected to the fur tax and the disruptions of colonial contact, were never flooded out by masses of Russian settlers in the way that indigenous peoples in more hospitable regions were. The cold was, paradoxically, a form of protection. It kept the colonizers from getting too comfortable. By the time the 19th century arrived, Yakutsk had become an interesting place. It was a remote but functioning Russian outpost, the capital of an enormous administrative territory. It had a small but sophisticated educated class. It had become, somewhat improbably, a destination for political exiles, people whom the Tsar wanted to remove from the centers of power and deposit somewhere so inconvenient and far away that they could be safely forgotten. Among those exiles were some fascinating people: intellectuals, revolutionaries, scientists, the kind of people who, when told they were being sent to the ends of the earth for their political opinions, sat down and wrote books about it. Several significant works of 19th century Russian literature and political thought were either written in Yakutia or influenced deeply by its authors' experiences there. One of the more poignant aspects of the exile tradition is that a fair number of the exiles, people who had been sent there against their will, who had every reason to hate the place, actually came to love it. Yakutia does that to some people. Something about the scale of it, the silence, the dramatic beauty of the taiga in summer, and the blue-white crystalline perfection of the winter air. The place gets under your skin. Occasionally, people who were free to leave chose to stay. Meanwhile, the Saka people continued to adapt. Their population had recovered from the catastrophic early colonial period. They remained the dominant ethnic group in the territory. Their language survived, unusual among indigenous languages in the Russian Empire, partly because the geographic isolation of many communities made linguistic replacement difficult. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Saka were navigating a curious double identity, participating in the Russian colonial economy and administrative system, while maintaining a cultural life that was still recognizably their own. And then, in 1917, everything changed again. The Soviet freeze within the freeze, the Russian Revolution, when it came, did not skip Yakutia just because Yakutia was cold and remote and extremely inconvenient to get to. Revolutions don't care about logistics. The Bolsheviks arrived, and with them came the full project of Soviet modernization, collectivization, industrialization, the reorganization of society along Marxist-Leninist lines. For the Saka people and the other indigenous groups of the region, this meant a second great disruption in 3 centuries. This one more systematic and more ideologically thorough than the first. Nomadic herding was collectivized, which is a polite way of saying that people who had lived by moving with their animals were told to stop moving and join collective farms. Shamanism was suppressed. Traditional religious practices were declared backward and counter-revolutionary. The oral literature, the ceremonies, the complex spiritual life of the Saka people, all of it was officially unwelcome in the new Soviet order, which had no patience for what it considered primitive superstition. Effects were profound and lasting. The shamanic tradition was driven underground, where it survived in a diminished and fragmented form. The traditional knowledge systems about land, whether animals, plants, were devalued in favor of scientific and ideological frameworks that didn't always account for the specific realities of Arctic life. And yet, there was also investment. The Soviets were, whatever their many and serious flaws, genuinely committed to modernizing the regions they controlled. Schools were built, hospitals were built, roads we will talk a great deal about one particular road were built. Literacy rates rose. Life expectancy rose. The city of Yakutsk grew substantially during the Soviet period, as workers and administrators and families were moved into the region to support the industrialization project. The industrialization of Yakutia under the Soviets was driven by resources. The region was understood correctly to be extraordinarily rich in valuable materials: gold, tin, coal, natural gas, and eventually, most significantly, diamonds. In 1949, Soviet geologists discovered the first officially recorded diamond in the Vilyui River basin. By the mid-1950s, large deposits had been found, and the Soviet state launched a massive effort to exploit them. The town of Mirny was founded in 1959, specifically around diamond mining. The flagship mine was called Mir, Peace, in Russian, and it became one of the most productive diamond mines in the world. The Mir mine was enormous. It was an open-pit operation, and by the time it was done, the pit was more than a kilometer in diameter and 525 meters deep. Aerial photographs of it look like something from another planet. A vast, spiraling vortex of excavated earth and rock, dropping into the permafrost like a wound in the landscape. The road spiraling down to the bottom of the pit was so long that trucks took up to an hour to complete the descent. Mining in permafrost conditions is a specific kind of technical challenge. The ground is frozen, which makes initial excavation extremely difficult. Workers used jet engines to thaw the permafrost and explosives to blast through the rock beneath it. But the cold created its own problems. In winter, the temperature inside the mine could drop to minus 55 degrees Celsius, and equipment that wasn't designed for those conditions would simply fail. Tires shattered, oil froze, steel became brittle. Every piece of machinery had to be specially adapted, and the workers themselves had to adapt. The Saka people and other locals who worked the mines were, in a sense, already adapted. They understood cold in a way that imported workers from warmer parts of Russia did not. But even for them, working in minus 50 in a mine was its own challenge. In the 1960s, the Mir mine was producing 10 million carats of diamonds per year, of which around 20% were gem quality. Those diamonds were processed and sold around the world, most of them going to polishing centers in Moscow before being exported. The revenue went to the Soviet state and was redistributed according to Soviet priorities, which meant that Yakutia itself didn't necessarily see much of the benefit directly, even though it was sitting on one of the great mineral treasuries of the world. Today, the Saka Republic produces roughly a quarter of the world's diamonds. The mining operation is run by a company called Alrosa, which is majority owned by the Russian state and the regional government. It employs a significant portion of the working population in the diamond-producing areas. The industry is the backbone of the regional economy, but between the diamond discovery of 1949 and the economic transformation of the post-Soviet era, there is a dark period of Soviet history that ran parallel to the industrialization story, and that we cannot avoid. Because in Yakutia, the road to modernization was built quite literally on human bones. The Road of Bones, there is a highway in the Russian Far East called the Kolyma Highway. It runs approximately 2,000 kilometers from the city of Yakutsk eastward to the port city of Magadan on the Sea of Okhotsk. It passes through some of the most remote and inhospitable territory on Earth: frozen river crossings, mountain passes, taiga stretching to every horizon, stretches of road where you can drive for hours without seeing another vehicle or any sign of human habitation. Locals call it the trassa, the route. The rest of the world, when they know about it at all, tends to call it by its other name, the Road of Bones. In the 1930s, gold and platinum had been discovered in the Kolyma region, east of Yakutsk. The Soviet state needed to get workers and equipment into the region and get ore back out. There were no roads. The territory was wilderness. The solution, in the Soviet logic of that period, was to build a road. And the labor pool for that road was going to be the Gulag system. Starting in 1932, prisoners from the Soviet labor camp network began building the Kolyma Highway by hand. Not by machine, by hand. With shovels and wheelbarrows, hacking through permafrost and taiga and mountain terrain in temperatures that dropped to -60. They worked in camps strung out along the proposed route, clearing forest, grading earth, building bridges over frozen rivers, working in conditions that were designed not merely to be productive, but to be punishing. The people who built this road were not, for the most part, criminals in any meaningful sense. The Gulag had expanded massively during Stalin's Great Terror of the late 1930s, and the camp population included political dissidents, academics, artists, writers, peasants who had been accused of resisting collectivization, ethnic minorities who were considered politically unreliable, ordinary citizens arrested on denunciations from neighbors or co-workers, or simply to fill quotas. The variety of people who ended up building the Road of Bones is almost impossible to convey. It included rocket scientists and poets and farmers and teachers, people who had done nothing whatsoever, and people who had committed the crime of thinking something the wrong person overheard. Among the more famous Kolyma survivors was Sergei Korolev, the rocket scientist who would later lead the Soviet space program, the man responsible for Sputnik and for sending Yuri Gagarin into space. Korolev was arrested in 1938, sentenced to death, and eventually sent to the labor camps, where he lost most of his teeth to scurvy. He survived, was released, and went on to help win the space race. He was lucky in a way that most of his fellow prisoners were not. The Kolyma camps were, even within the Gulag system, notorious for their brutality. The cold alone was lethal. Winter temperatures regularly dropped below -50, and sometimes much lower, and the camps provided clothing and shelter that were inadequate even for normal Siberian winter, let alone for the extremes of the Kolyma region. Food was minimal, calculated to keep prisoners working, but not to keep them healthy for long. Those those who couldn't work were punished. Those who felt too ill to work were often simply left to die. The death toll of the Kolyma camps is one of those historical figures that scholars argue about because the Soviet records were incomplete, deliberately vague, or in some cases destroyed. Estimates range from 125,000 to well over 1 million dead in the Kolyma region over the years of the system's operation. What is not in dispute is that people died in enormous numbers, and that they died building the road. The permafrost made burial extremely difficult. The ground was frozen solid, and digging graves in the normal sense was practically impossible with the tools available. So the dead were often buried where they fell alongside the road or beneath it, incorporated into the road's foundation. There is a detail in the survivor accounts and memoirs that keeps recurring. Prisoners said there was one body for every meter of road built. One body per meter. 2,000 kilometers. Do the math, and the name explains itself. The Road of Bones. Construction continued until 1953, when Stalin died, and the Gulag system was gradually wound down. The road was finished. The gold and the tin and the uranium were being extracted and shipped out. The camps were closed, and most of the survivors made their way home, if they still had a home to go to. But the road remained. It's still there. You can drive it today if you have the right vehicle and a good reason, and a fairly high tolerance for remoteness and risk. It's mostly unpaved, riddled with potholes, subject to flooding in spring when the ice breaks up, and in winter subject to conditions that require, as we'll discuss, a very particular set of driving preparations. Along the road, you can still find traces of the camp system, ruins of wooden buildings, rusted barbed wire, the remnants of watchtowers. Some of the ghost towns along the route were founded as Gulag camps, and then converted into civilian settlements when the camps closed, populated by workers drawn by the promise of high wages and Arctic hazard pay. After the Soviet collapse in 1991, many of those settlements simply emptied out as the economic logic that had created them disappeared. Rows of abandoned apartment blocks stand in the taiga, their windows dark, their roofs collapsing, slowly being reclaimed by the cold. At the western end of the road, in Magadan, there's a monument called the Mask of Sorrow. It was designed by the sculptor Ernst Niesvestny and erected in 1996. It's a large stone face, one eye weeping human figures, the other a small barred window. It's a memorial to everyone who died in the Kolyma camps and on the road that connects them. It stands on a hill overlooking the city, and when you see it, the scale of what happened only begins to come into focus. The Ukrainian painter Nikolai Getman, who survived 9 years in the Kolyma camps, spent decades after his release recording his experiences in a series of paintings. In an explanation of his work, he wrote something that bears repeating here, because it captures something essential about why this history matters. He said that some people thought the Gulag was a forgotten part of history, that there was no need to be reminded of it. He disagreed. He said the people must be reminded, that it was essential, that the crimes he had witnessed were too monstrous to let fade. The road of bones passes through the landscape of Yakutia like a scar. Above it, the sky is enormous. The taiga stretches endlessly in every direction. In winter, the silence is so complete that you can hear your own heartbeat. And beneath the road, in the frozen ground that never thaws, are the bones of people who were sent there by a state that considered them expendable. It's not a comfortable thing to know, but it's part of the story of this place, and we're not going to skip it. What cold actually does to everything, let's take a little breath here and talk about the cold itself. Not in terms of history or politics or tragedy, just the physics and the lived reality of it. Because if you're going to understand how people survive in Yakutia, you need to understand what they're surviving against. At minus 40 degrees Celsius, rubber becomes brittle. Car tires, if not specifically designed for extreme cold, can crack and shatter as though they're made of glass. This is not a theoretical concern for drivers in Yakutsk. It's a practical one that informs which tires you buy and how you maintain them. Steel also behaves differently at extreme cold. It becomes more brittle, less able to absorb impact without fracturing. Bridges and machinery and tools must be designed with this in mind. There are specific cold-tolerant steel alloys used in Arctic construction because the regular stuff will crack under mechanical stress when the temperature is low enough. Metal objects left outside in extreme cold become genuinely dangerous. A pair of metal-framed glasses left on your face at minus 50 will freeze to your skin. A metal doorknob can cause frostbite on bare skin in seconds. This sounds dramatic, but it's simply physics. At extreme cold, any material that conducts heat efficiently will pull the warmth from your skin faster than your body can replace it. Ink freezes in pens. Screens on electronics crack if exposed to the cold for too long before being allowed to warm up slowly. Electronics in general don't function properly at extreme temperatures. Batteries die almost immediately. Circuits malfunction. Yakutsk residents carry their phones inside their coats against their bodies to keep them warm. Condensation is a particular problem. When you go from a warm interior to the outside cold, the moisture in the warm air around you begins to condense and freeze instantly. Your breath comes out as a visible cloud, and that cloud freezes into tiny ice crystals that fall, tinkling faintly, to the ground. There's a local name for this, the frost smoke, or in Russian something like the breath crystals. It's beautiful in a way. It also means that going outside requires an immediate calculation. How much moisture am I producing? And how fast is it going to freeze on whatever it lands on? Your eyelashes. When you blink in extreme cold, the moisture from your eyes transfers to your lashes and freezes. Your lashes stick together. You learn, very quickly, to blink in a specific controlled way that minimizes moisture transfer. Or you carry a little cloth to gently separate them. It sounds like a small thing until you're standing outside in minus 50 and your eyes are welded shut. Exposed skin frostbites in minutes. Real frostbite, the kind that destroys tissue. Not just the numbness and tingling of mild cold exposure, but the actual cellular death that leads to blackened fingers and amputations. At -40, exposed skin can begin to suffer frostbite in less than 10 minutes. At -50, in less than 5. At the extreme temperatures recorded in Oymyakon, it can happen in under a minute. This is why in Yakutia, the first commandment of winter life is cover everything. No skin should be visible outside, not a sliver. The standard winter wear involves multiple layers: base thermal layer, mid-insulation layer, outer windproof and waterproof shell. The face is covered by a balaclava or a heavy scarf. The head is covered by a hat, often made of real fur, specifically the fur of the Yakutian horse or reindeer, which provides warmth that synthetic materials struggle to match. The hands wear gloves inside mittens. The feet are a special concern. Boots must be warm enough to keep your feet from freezing when you're standing outside, but not so tight that they restrict circulation, because restricted circulation in extreme cold means frostbite. Traditional Yakut footwear, boots made from reindeer skin, with the fur turned inward, is, according to people who have tried both, significantly more effective at extreme temperatures than any modern synthetic boot. The Saka people developed their boot making over centuries, and the result is a garment optimized for survival in a very specific environment. The cold also affects your breathing. Cold air is dry air, and breathing extremely cold air dries out the mucous membranes of your nose and throat. You can develop a kind of cold-induced respiratory distress just from going outside. Many Yakutsk residents cover their nose and mouth with layers of fabric in extreme cold, specifically to pre-warm the air before it reaches their lungs. At -50 and below, the warm, moist air from your mouth can freeze as it leaves your lips, creating tiny ice crystals that fall. When temperatures are in that range, there is sometimes a faint crackling sound in the air around a person, the sound of water, vapor instantly crystallizing. It's one of those details that gets reported by outsiders who visit in winter and find it equal parts magical and deeply alarming. Now, let's talk about cars, because cars in Yakutia are a special category of human achievement and daily headache. The problem is simple. If you park a car outside at -45 and turn off the engine, there is a reasonable chance you will never start it again. The engine oil thickens and eventually gels. Diesel fuel can become waxy. The battery dies rapidly because chemical reactions in batteries slow dramatically in cold temperatures, reducing power output. The rubber seals around doors and windows become stiff and may crack. The transmission fluid thickens. Essentially, your car becomes a large, very expensive frozen object. The solution to this problem, practiced routinely in Yakutia, is to not turn off your car. In the coldest months, many cars simply run continuously. You park outside the shop, leave the engine running, go in for 20 minutes, come back. You leave the engine running overnight if you don't have access to a heated garage. You leave the engine running while you sleep, if you must. The fuel cost is significant, but the alternative, having to somehow warm up a completely frozen vehicle is worse. The specific techniques for starting a very cold car when you've had no choice but to turn it off involve blowtorches applied carefully to the engine block to warm the oil, electric block heaters plugged in overnight wherever electricity is available. And in extreme cases, the services of someone with a tow rope and a functioning warm car. Automotive workshops in Yakutsk do a brisk business in winter. There's also the matter of the roads themselves. Permafrost creates a specific kind of road surface problem. In summer, the top layer of soil thaws slightly, which can cause subsidence and potholes on a scale that makes even well-maintained roads challenging. Roads built directly on permafrost without proper insulation can collapse as the ground beneath them shifts. Yakutsk has a whole category of road engineering challenges that simply don't exist in most cities. In winter, some of the most important roads in the region are not roads at all in the conventional sense. They're ice roads, routes that follow frozen rivers and lakes, usable only when the ice is thick enough to support the weight of vehicles. The Lena River, when frozen, becomes a highway. Trucks cross it. Supply convoys cross it. Ferries that operate in summer are replaced by ice roads in winter, connecting communities that would otherwise be completely cut off. There's something quietly beautiful about that. The same river that carries boats in summer becomes a road in winter. The cold, which takes so much, also gives something back. It freezes the water into pavement. The ground that never thaws beneath Yakutia, stretching down in some places for more than a kilometer, is permafrost. Permafrost is exactly what it sounds like: ground that is permanently frozen, that has been continuously frozen for at least 2 years, and often for thousands or tens of thousands of years. In Yakutia, the permafrost is ancient. Some of it has been frozen continuously since the last ice age. It is, in a geological sense, one of the great preserved features of the Pleistocene, the deep time when ice dominated the northern continents. The permafrost is also an archive. Because it's frozen, it preserves organic material almost indefinitely. In conditions where decay is simply impossible, the absence of microbial activity means that things buried in permafrost stay intact for a very, very long time. This is why Yakutia is one of the world's premier sources of woolly mammoth remains. The mammoths that roamed the Siberian plains tens of thousands of years ago frequently fell into bogs or streams that subsequently froze, and their bodies have been preserved in the permafrost ever since, waiting for the slow erosion of riverbeds and hillsides to bring them back to the surface. Yakutsk has a mammoth museum that is, by multiple accounts, extraordinary. Not a reconstruction museum with casts and models, an actual museum with actual mammoth bodies, specimens still with fur, specimens with tissue intact. A baby mammoth named Masha, found in 1977, so perfectly preserved that scientists have been able to study her contents and even attempt DNA extraction. The permafrost is a time machine, and the mammoths are its most spectacular passengers. There have been genuine scientific attempts, driven partly by Yakutia's permafrost archives, to work toward cloning woolly mammoths using preserved DNA. The science is real, even if the practical obstacles remain formidable. Yakutia, in a very literal sense, may one day be the place where an extinct species is brought back from the deep freeze, which would be extremely on brand for a region where the freezer never turns off. But permafrost is not only an asset. For the people who live on top of it, permafrost is one of the defining engineering challenges of their existence. The problem is heat. Buildings generate heat. That heat radiates downward into the ground. If the ground beneath a building is permafrost, and that heat is sufficient to melt some of it, the ground becomes soft and unstable. The building shifts, tilts, cracks, and eventually, if the problem isn't addressed, it collapses. This has happened. It still happens. Drive through Yakutsk, and you will see buildings that lean visibly, their foundations compromised by permafrost thaw beneath them. The standard solution in Yakutsk for the past several decades is to build on stilts. Specifically, buildings are elevated on concrete piles driven deep into the permafrost, with a gap of air between the base of the building and the ground surface. That air gap is crucial. It allows cold air to circulate beneath the building, keeping the permafrost frozen. The heat from the building never reaches the ground. The permafrost stays frozen. The building stays upright. This is why Yakutsk looks the way it does. Nearly every building in the city is elevated on these piles. The visual effect is of a city that has been lifted slightly off the ground. A city on stilts. A city that is deliberately not touching the earth beneath it. It looks strange at first. After a while, it makes perfect sense. The same logic applies to other infrastructure. Pipes cannot be buried underground, because buried pipes would either freeze solid, useless, or generate enough heat to destabilize the permafrost around them, dangerous. The solution is to run them above ground, heavily insulated, in large metal ducts that snake through the city at walking height or above. These duct pipes are one of the most distinctive visual features of Yakutsk. They crisscross the streets, bridge buildings, run along alleyways, creating a kind of industrial circulatory system in full view. Heating these insulated pipes is a constant engineering task because the temperature differential between the hot water inside and the outside air in winter can exceed 80 degrees Celsius. Even well-insulated pipes lose heat in those conditions. The heating systems of Yakutsk are large, centralized, and critically important. A failure of the city's heating infrastructure in the depths of winter is not a nuisance. It's potentially lethal. There's a saying in Yakutsk, or at least there should be, that the city lives by its pipes. The pipes carry heat and water and sewage and gas, and without them, the city would stop functioning in very short order. The people who maintain those pipes in January, when the outside temperature is minus 45, and the insulation is fighting the whole of Siberia, deserve rather more recognition than they typically receive. Now, climate change is beginning to create new problems for a city built on the assumption that the permafrost stays permanently frozen. Because the permafrost is thawing. Not everywhere, not all at once, but incrementally and undeniably. The average temperature in Yakutia has risen over recent decades. The active layer, the seasonal top layer that thaws in summer and refreezes in winter, is getting deeper. Permafrost that has been frozen for thousands of years is beginning to soften. For the people of Yakutsk, this is not an abstract concern. Buildings that were stable for decades are beginning to shift and settle in ways that their engineers didn't design for. Foundations that were driven into permafrost that was assumed to be solid are finding softer ground beneath them. Roads are subsiding. The complex calculus of Arctic construction. How deep does your pile need to go? How much air gap do you need? How much insulation has to be recalculated based on conditions that are no longer static? There's also a global consequence to the permafrost thawing, and it's a large one. Permafrost contains enormous quantities of organic carbon, the decomposed remains of ancient plants and animals preserved in the freeze for millennia. When permafrost thaws, that organic material begins to decompose, releasing carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere. Methane is a significantly more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. The permafrost of Siberia is estimated to contain more carbon than the entire atmosphere currently holds. If that carbon begins releasing in large quantities, it could create a self-reinforcing feedback loop. Thaw releases carbon. Carbon warms the atmosphere. Warming thaws more permafrost, which releases more carbon. This is why climate scientists pay close attention to Siberia. What happens to the permafrost of Yakutia is not a local story. It's a global story, playing out in slow motion in one of the most remote places on Earth. The people of Yakutia know this. When researchers have interviewed residents about permafrost thaw, the responses are not abstract or theoretical. People describe watching landscapes change, rivers that flood differently than they used to, ground that used to hold firm in summer now soft and unstable, buildings that their parents built in places that were considered safe, now tilting. One resident described it in the way that people who live very close to the land tend to describe environmental change as the feeling that the ground is no longer reliable, that the solid thing beneath your feet is becoming uncertain. In Yakutia, where the frozen ground is both challenge and foundation, this is not a metaphor. It's a description of reality. What people eat when everything is frozen. Let's talk about food. Because what you eat in one of the coldest places on Earth is necessarily a very specific thing, and it tells you a great deal about both the ingenuity and the practicality of the people who live there. The starting point is the climate problem. You cannot grow almost anything in Yakutia. The growing season is short, essentially July and part of August, during which the top layer of the permafrost softens enough to permit shallow root vegetables and some hardier above-ground crops. But agriculture in any meaningful sense is essentially impossible. frost-free period is simply too brief and too unreliable. Planting a wheat field in Yakutia is not a practical project. This means that the traditional diet of the Saka people and other indigenous groups of Yakutia was built almost entirely around animal products: meat, fat, fish, and dairy. Not as a choice or a preference, but as a physical necessity. What the land provided in large quantities was animals, reindeer, horses, fish, elk, various small game. And those animals were the food supply. The caloric demands of living in extreme cold are not trivial. Your body burns dramatically more energy when the outside temperature is -40 than when it's +20. You need more food, and that food needs to be higher in fat and protein than a standard diet. A diet of lean protein alone won't keep you alive in Yakutia. Your body needs fat to generate and sustain heat, and lots of it. This is why the traditional Saka diet is so heavily meat and fat-based. Reindeer meat is a staple, lean, protein-rich, sustainable in the local environment, and available year-round because the animals can survive the winter without human intervention. Horse meat is important, and the Yakutian horse not only provided meat, but also milk, which was fermented into a traditional drink called kumis, a mildly alcoholic beverage made from mare's milk that was considered both nutritious and warming. The Saka were, for a long time, the northernmost horse breeding people in the world. Fish is central. The rivers and lakes of Yakutia are teeming with fish: Arctic cisco, muksun, whitefish, various salmonids. Fishing has always been a major food source, and the combination of cold water and cold air means that fresh fish in Yakutia has a natural preservation system built in. You catch the fish, it freezes immediately in the winter air, and it stays preserved until you want to eat it. This brings us to one of the most distinctive foods of Yakutia: stroganina. Stroganina is raw frozen fish, sliced. That's really all it is. You take a frozen fish, usually a whitefish, a muksun, or an Arctic cisco, and you shave or slice extremely thin pieces from the frozen flesh. You eat these slices as they are, cold and raw, with a bit of salt, sometimes pepper, sometimes nothing. If you've spent your life eating cooked fish, the idea of eating it frozen and raw may sound unpleasant. But stroganina has a substantial following among people who have tried it, including many visitors who expected to hate it and didn't. The texture of frozen raw fish is quite different from the soft, flaky texture of cooked fish. It's firm, almost crunchy at the surface, with a clean, extremely fresh flavor. The freezing kills parasites, making it safe to eat in a way that warm raw fish wouldn't be. At the outdoor markets of Yakutsk in winter, frozen fish stand upright in bins like wooden planks, sold by weight, and stroganina is shaved or sliced to order. The outdoor market in Yakutsk in winter is one of those experiences that visitors tend to describe with a mixture of fascination and slight bewilderment. Everything is frozen. The fish are frozen. The meat is frozen. Slabs of horse liver and reindeer haunch and elk shoulder sit in the open air, perfectly preserved by the ambient temperature. No refrigeration required. The cold is the refrigerator. The Yakutsk outdoor market in January operates in temperatures where the food is simply not going to spoil, because nothing can biologically decompose at -40. There's also a tradition of eating certain frozen foods that in warmer climates would need to be cooked. Frozen horse blood is served in some traditional contexts. Various organ meats are eaten frozen or nearly frozen. The principle is the same throughout. If the cold preserves it and the fat content is high enough, eat it. Ogos is a traditional Saka dish of boiled horse ribs, often eaten with the marrow intact. The marrow is particularly prized in cold climates because it's almost entirely fat, pure, dense, calorie-rich. Exactly what your body needs when it's working to maintain core temperature against the exterior cold. You eat marrow in Yakutia, and your body thanks you in ways your nutritionist back in a temperate city would probably not endorse. There's also indigirka, a traditional fish salad made from frozen raw fish, usually muksun, onions, and oil. The name comes from the Indigirka River, one of the great rivers of Yakutia. It's a dish that exists entirely because of the cold. The combination of fat from the oil and protein from the raw frozen fish is a practical cold weather food, not a culinary affectation. Dairy is present in the traditional diet too, in the form of products from the cold, hardy Yakutian cattle. Salamat is a traditional porridge made with millet and horse fat or butter, thick and calorie-dense. Kiwachek is a dessert made from whipped cow's milk or cream with local berries, cloudberries, cranberries, lingonberries, folded in. Berries are one of the few plant-based foods available in Yakutia, and they tend to be preserved by freezing and used through the winter. What you don't eat a lot of in traditional Yakut cuisine is grain or vegetables. Fresh fruit and vegetables are, in modern Yakutsk, available in the shops, imported at considerable expense from warmer regions of Russia. But they're expensive, and locals have a somewhat pragmatic relationship with them. You eat them if they're available and affordable, but you don't depend on them. The traditional diet functions perfectly well without them. There's a vodka tradition worth mentioning, too. In Oymyakon specifically, there's a local drink called Ruski chai, Russian tea, which is, in fact, vodka. It's called tea with evident local humor. The belief is that vodka helps keep you warm, a belief that is medically complicated alcohol actually causes vasodilation, which increases heat loss from the extremities. But that has a certain behavioral logic. Vodka impairs the perception of cold, which is either a helpful adaptation or a description of what hypothermia does to your mood, depending on how you look at it. Either way, vodka is a significant presence in Yakutian life, as it is in cold climate cultures around the world. Whether it actually keeps you warm is debatable. Whether it makes you feel warmer is not. Dressing for the end of the world, if there is one skill that the people of Yakutia have developed to a genuinely extraordinary degree, it is the skill of dressing for cold. This is not a small thing. In Yakutia, how you dress is a survival decision, and the difference between correct layering and incorrect layering is the difference between arriving safely at your destination and suffering frostbite on the way. The traditional Saka cold weather outfit begins from the ground up, because the ground is where the cold comes from as much as the air. Footwear. Traditional Yakut boots are called taksui, or in some regions, kirki. They are made from the skin of the reindeer or the Yakutian horse, with the fur turned inward to trap air and heat. The construction is designed to be roomy. Your toes should not press against the outer layer because compression reduces insulation and blood flow, both of which increase the risk of frostbite. Inside the boots, you may wear socks of wool or additional layers of skin. The outer surface of the boot is leather or skin, designed to shed snow without absorbing it. The warmth of these traditional boots is reported consistently by both locals and outside visitors who have had the opportunity to compare, as superior to even the best modern synthetic cold weather boots. This is not nostalgia. It's a pragmatic assessment. The Saka people spent centuries optimizing these boots for survival in their specific environment. And the result is a technology that modern materials science struggles to fully match for extreme cold. Moving up the body, the base layer is usually wool or fur against the skin, then mid-layer insulation, then an outer layer of deer or seal skin, or in modern times, a thick insulated synthetic coat. The principle is the same as modern layering systems. Trap air close to the body, let moisture escape, block wind, but the materials are different and the margins are much tighter. The head is critical. More heat escapes from the head than from most other parts of the body. A proper winter hat in Yakutia is not a fashion accessory. It's a piece of survival equipment. Traditional hats are made from fox fur, with ear flaps that tie under the chin. The ears are among the most vulnerable extremities to frostbite. They're exposed and relatively poorly perfused with blood. Covering them adequately is not optional. The face. The face is perhaps the single hardest part of the body to keep warm in extreme cold, because you need to see and breathe. A balaclava or heavy face wrap covers everything except the eyes. Some people wear goggles in extreme conditions to protect the eyes themselves. The small strip of skin visible around the eyes is typically the most exposed skin on a properly dressed Yakutian winter walker, and even that strip requires attention. Gloves inside mittens. The logic here is practical. Gloves allow fine motor control of the fingers, which you sometimes need even in extreme cold. But gloves alone at -50 are not warm enough. Mittens go over the gloves to add an additional layer of insulation and to protect the fingers as a group. Keeping fingers together inside a mitten allows them to share body heat, which individual finger gloves cannot do. In modern Yakutsk, the traditional fur-based cold weather gear exists alongside contemporary synthetic gear, and residents use a combination of both. High-quality down parkas, synthetic base layers, modern insulated boots, all these have their place. But fur remains present, respected, and practiced genetically superior for the extremes. You'll see women in Yakutsk wearing full-length fox fur coats with perfect unself-consciousness, because in Yakutia, that coat is not a luxury item. It's the warmest thing available. There are rules for dressing in Yakutia that are taught to children from the time they're old enough to go outside. And these rules are not suggestions. They are presented as facts of life in the same tone that children elsewhere are taught to look both ways before crossing the road. Rule 1. Cover everything. No skin exposed, none. Rule 2. Don't rush. When you're getting dressed to go outside, take your time. If you rush and forget something, leave a gap at the wrist. Forget the scarf. You may not notice until you're already cold, and by then you've already lost precious heat. Rule 3. Don't sweat. Sweating in extreme cold is dangerous because wet clothing loses its insulating properties dramatically. If you're exerting yourself, you should reduce your pace before you sweat, not after. Rule 4. Get inside before you get cold. Don't wait until you're numb to go in. Numbness is already a problem. The goal is to come back inside before numbness sets in. These rules are so thoroughly internalized by lifelong residents of Yakutia that following them becomes automatic background computation, not deliberate thought. Ask a Yakutian to describe their morning dressing routine, and they'll probably struggle to articulate all the micro decisions they make, because they've made them so many thousands of times that they've been compressed into muscle memory. There are also rules for what not to do, and these are the ones that outsiders tend to learn the hard way. Don't wear metal jewelry. At -40, a metal ring or earring will conduct heat away from your skin fast enough to cause frostbite. Don't wear contact lenses outside in extreme cold. The moisture on the surface of your eye can freeze around them, which is as unpleasant as it sounds. Don't breathe through your mouth when it can be avoided. Cold air entering the lungs is better pre-warmed by the narrower passages of the nose, which acts as a natural heat exchanger. Don't drink alcohol and then try to walk any distance outside. The perceived warmth of alcohol is not actual warmth, and the impairment of judgment about how cold you actually are has contributed to deaths. Don't touch metal with bare skin, ever. The Yakut soul, culture, language, and the deep magic of the cold, at some point in this narrative, we should stop talking about survival mechanics, the boots and the pipes and the frozen fish, and talk about something harder to measure, but equally real. We should talk about what it means, spiritually and culturally, to be a person from Yakutia. Because Yakutia is not just a place where survival is difficult. It's a place where a culture of remarkable depth and sophistication developed in direct relationship with the cold. The cold shaped not only how the Saka people dressed and ate, but how they saw the world, what they believed, how they sang. The Yakut language, Saka, is a Turkic language, distantly related to Turkish and Kazakh and Uzbek, languages spoken by peoples of Central Asia and the steppe. The fact that a Turkic language is the first language of people living at 60 degrees north latitude in the Russian Far East is one of those linguistic mysteries that opens up onto a whole history. The migration north, the centuries of adaptation, the the cultural synthesis with the Evenks and Yukagirs and other northern peoples, Saka is still very much alive. It has around 450,000 speakers, which makes it one of the more robust indigenous languages in Russia. It holds official status in the Saka Republic alongside Russian. It is spoken in daily life, used in education, broadcast on television and radio. This is not something to take for granted. The survival of an indigenous language under centuries of Russian imperial and Soviet pressure is genuinely remarkable, and it's due in large part to the geographic isolation of many Saka communities, which made linguistic replacement more difficult. The Komis. Let's talk about the Komis. The Komis is a jaw harp, one of the simplest musical instruments in existence, and one of the oldest. It's a small metal or bone frame, roughly the shape of a teardrop, with a flexible tongue in the middle. You hold the frame between your teeth, pluck the tongue, and shape the sound with your mouth cavity. The result is a haunting, buzzing, resonant drone that can be shaped into melodies by changing the position of your lips and tongue and the configuration of your throat. In Saka culture, the Komis was historically associated with shamanic practice. The sound of the Komis was believed to facilitate contact with the spirit world, to mimic the voices of animals and natural forces, to communicate in frequencies that went beyond the merely human. Shamans played it in rituals. Women played it as a form of personal expression, coding emotional states into the variations of the drone. It was an instrument of immense subtlety for something so physically simple. The Soviet era suppressed the Komis along with shamanism generally, and its practice declined. But in the post-Soviet revival of Saka culture, the Komis has come roaring back. There are now master Komis players who perform internationally. There are competitions. There's a Komis museum in Yakutsk. The instrument is recognized as one of the most distinctive cultural artifacts of the Saka people, and its survival into the modern era, through suppression and adaptation and revival, mirrors in miniature the survival of the culture itself. Then there is the alonko. If the Komis is the instrument of Saka spiritual life, the alonko is its literature. The alonko is an epic oral tradition, cycles of heroic narrative poetry, passed from master storyteller to student across generations, performed from memory in performances that could last for days. The stories involve the Ayi, the benevolent sky spirits, and the Abasi, the darker underworld forces, and the human heroes who navigate between these worlds, performing deeds of strength and cunning and endurance. The performers of alonko are called alonkasats, and the best of them were once among the most respected members of Saka society, living libraries of cultural knowledge, entertainers, moral educators, historical memory. The tradition declined during the Soviet period for the same reasons shamanism declined. It was seen as backward, pre-modern, incompatible with the project of ideological modernization. Many alonkasats died without fully transmitting their repertoire, but the tradition survived in fragments, and in the devotion of those who refused to let it go entirely. In 2005, UNESCO proclaimed the Oymyakon a masterpiece of the oral and intangible heritage of humanity. This designation didn't save the tradition single-handedly, but it gave it legitimacy and visibility, and the revival of interest in Saka cultural heritage in the post-Soviet era has brought the Oymyakon back to some prominence. Younger Saka people are learning it again. New Oymyakosuts are trained. The stories are being recorded, written down, translated. In Yakutsk, there's an art center, the Arctic Center of Epos and Arts, dedicated specifically to the preservation and performance of Oymyakon. The very fact that this building was constructed in a city that has enough engineering challenges just keeping the lights on in winter is a statement. It says, "This matters. The story of who we are matters. The cold doesn't get to take that." The annual Oymyakon festival is perhaps the most visible expression of Saka cultural identity in the modern era. Held in late June, around the summer solstice, Oymyakon is the Saka New Year, a celebration of the return of light, of survival through another winter, of the renewal that summer brings. It draws Saka people from across the Republic to a gathering that involves traditional ceremonies performed by elders, horse racing, traditional sports, including wrestling and archery, and a kind of competitive improvised poetic duel, communal feasting, traditional music, and dance. The traditional sports deserve a brief mention because they're wonderfully specific to the environment. Ma's wrestling, for instance, two competitors sit on opposite sides of a wooden stick, grip it with both hands, and try to pull each other over. It's a test of pure grip strength and leverage. There's also a traditional Yakut jumping discipline that involves hopping on one foot in specific patterns across the frozen ground, building coordination and lower body strength that's genuinely useful when you're navigating ice. The presence of a punk rock scene in Yakutsk. Yes, there is one, and of a growing film industry that has been gaining international recognition, sometimes called Sakawood, with obvious affection for the absurdity of the name, suggests that Yakutian culture is not static, not stuck in the amber of tradition. It's alive and evolving, absorbing new influences while maintaining something distinctively its own. Movies made in Yakutsk deal with local landscapes and local stories, shot in conditions that would shut down most Western film productions. There's something authentic about a horror movie filmed in an environment where the environment itself is already a little terrifying. Shamanism has never fully disappeared, despite the Soviet-era suppression. It went underground, became private, merged in some cases with Orthodox Christianity into the dual belief system that Russian observers noted. People who light a candle in church and also invite a shaman to bless their new house. The two traditions coexist in the same person without apparent contradiction, which is probably a more sensible approach to spiritual uncertainty than most institutionalized religions would admit. The shamanic worldview, which understood the natural world as populated with spirits, which saw the relationship between human and landscape as a reciprocal one, requiring ongoing attention and respect. Maps in interesting ways onto contemporary concerns about environmental conservation. The idea that you should not take more from the land than you need, that extraction has consequences that run in spiritual as well as physical directions, is an idea with obvious modern resonance in a region that is being mined heavily for diamonds and gold while its permafrost is thawing. Oymyakon, the end of the line. Let's go further. Let's leave Yakutsk and travel the road of bones to the north and east, through the taiga and the highlands, toward the place where the numbers stop making intuitive sense. Oymyakon. The drive from Yakutsk to Oymyakon is approximately 920 kilometers, and it takes around 21 hours under normal conditions, which in winter means the specific conditions of driving the Kolyma highway when the temperature outside is somewhere between -40 and -60. There are no hotels along most of the route. There are fuel stops, but they're sparse. And running out of fuel on the Kolyma highway in January is a predicament that requires the kind of emergency preparations sensible people make in advance. The road passes through small settlements that would barely register as villages in most places, a handful of houses, a fuel stop, a small store if you're lucky. In between, there are long stretches of absolute wilderness. The taiga closes in around the road, dark trees, heavily laden with snow. The sky in winter is white or gray. The silence is extraordinary. As you climb into the Yana Oymyakon highlands, the terrain becomes more dramatic. The mountains here are not enormous by Himalayan standards, but they are imposing in the way of cold mountains, bare of vegetation above the tree line, swept by wind with the kind of stark beauty that comes from a landscape stripped of anything that doesn't absolutely have to be there. The cold deepens. The valley that contains Oymyakon sits at an altitude of about 750 meters, and the mountains surrounding it rise to 1,100 meters. The temperature in the valley is consistently lower than the temperature even a short distance upslope, because the cold air is heavier and flows downward, pooling in the lowest point it can find. Studies have shown that temperatures in the Oymyakon Valley increase with altitude. It's warmer on the surrounding hillsides than it is in the village in the center of the bowl. And then you arrive. Oymyakon is home to around 500 people. It has one store. It has a post office. It has a bank. It has a gas station that operates 24 hours a day, staffed by workers who do 2-week shifts, because the conditions are such that extended stays require rotation. It has a school. It has an airstrip, small and unpaved, usable in summer. There is a monument in the center of the village. It's a simple stone marker commemorating the temperature reading of January 1924, -71.2 degrees Celsius. The monument is surrounded by a little fence. In winter, it's surrounded by snow. Tourists come specifically to be photographed next to it, to have proof that they stood in the coldest inhabited place on Earth. The streets of Oymyakon in winter are empty. Not because people are staying home entirely, but because outside time is minimized to what is absolutely necessary. You go out to get to somewhere else. You move purposefully and quickly. You don't linger. The cold is not an ambient background condition to be tolerated. It's an active threat, and you treat it as such. The visiting photographer Amos Chappell, who traveled to Oymyakon to document life there, described the eerie emptiness of the streets. He expected to see people going about their business, bundled up against the cold. What he found, instead, was near complete absence from the outdoors, punctuated by rapid, purposeful movement when people did emerge. The village had the quality, he said, of a place that was inhabited, but not quite lived in, as though the people were waiting inside for conditions to improve. Life here is intensely interior. The social world of Oymyakon in winter is the world inside buildings. You visit neighbors through carefully connected networks of heated spaces when you can. You minimize the exposure between warm interior and frozen exterior. The culture of hospitality that characterizes many cold climate indigenous groups, the tradition of welcoming travelers, offering food and warmth, because the cold outside makes the denial of these things a moral failure, is very much present in Oymyakon. The hot spring nearby is a point of particular life. Animals are brought there to drink. The spring never freezes, and in a landscape where finding liquid water in winter is otherwise difficult, this eternal unfrozen pool is a resource of genuine value. The livestock cluster around it, steam rising from the water into the frozen air, creating a small cloud above the spring that you can see from a distance. In the depths of the cold, the hot spring is a small, stubborn reminder that warmth is possible. The school in Oymyakon remains open through most of the winter. Closing the school is reserved for the most extreme conditions. Below -55 Celsius is the general threshold for canceling classes for younger children, below -60 for the older ones. These are numbers that in most places on Earth would represent the absolute apocalyptic end of civilized life. In Oymyakon, they're the grounds for a snow day. Think about that. Parents in Oymyakon bundle their children in layers of fur and send them to school in temperatures that would cause immediate death in an improperly dressed adult. The children are dressed properly. They know how to be dressed properly. They've been learning since they could walk. And they go, and they learn, and they come home. The degree of intergenerational knowledge transfer required to maintain this is enormous. The cold adaptation of the people of Oymyakon is not biological, not in any meaningful sense. It's cultural. It's a body of knowledge about how to dress, how to move, how to build a fire, how to assess conditions, how to recognize the early signs of frostbite in yourself and others, how to help a frozen car engine, how to read the sky for weather. This knowledge is passed from grandparents to parents to children, refined over generations, collectively maintained by a community that understands its survival depends on getting it right. In the summer, Oymyakon transforms. The temperature can reach above 30 degrees Celsius in July. The same valley that records -70 in winter records, +30 in summer, a temperature range of more than 100 degrees, one of the largest annual temperature ranges of any inhabited place on Earth. In July, the sun barely sets, and the long Siberian summer arrives with a rush of green and light that is, by all accounts, extraordinarily beautiful. Wildflowers, birdsong, the smell of the taiga warming after months of deep freeze. The summer is brief and intense and cherished because the people of Oymyakon understand exactly what it is: the respite. The few months between winters when the land relents, when the sun is overhead instead of barely visible, when you can go outside without immediately beginning the countdown to hypothermia. And then August ends, and the temperature begins to fall, and the slow return of the cold begins. The preparations intensify: food stores, firewood, the maintenance of whatever equipment you'll need to make it through another winter. The cold is coming back, as it always does, as it has for as long as anyone has been living in this valley. It's patient. It has unlimited time. And the people of Oymyakon have learned over centuries exactly how to face it. Diamonds under ice, Yakutia's hidden wealth. We've talked about the cold and the people and the survival. Let's talk for a while about something else. The extraordinary fact that one of the coldest and most remote places on Earth is also sitting on one of the great mineral treasuries of the planet. Yakutia produces roughly a quarter of the world's diamonds. 25% of the entire global diamond supply comes from this frozen, barely accessible region of the Russian Far East. The diamonds are there because of a specific geological event that occurred hundreds of millions of years ago. Kimberlite eruptions that brought carbon-rich material from deep in the Earth's mantle to the surface, where over millennia it crystallized into diamonds. The Siberian craton, the ancient, stable geological platform that underlies Yakutia, is particularly rich in kimberlite pipes, the underground channels through which this material erupted. There are more than 200 known kimberlite pipe deposits in Yakutia. The diamonds were there the whole time, of course, while the Saka people herded their horses, and the Russian Cossacks came and went, and the Gulag prisoners built the Road of Bones. The diamonds don't care about any of that. They just sit in the permafrost, patient as only things that formed 3 billion years ago can be. Soviet geologists discovered them in the late 1940s and 1950s. The first significant deposit was found in 1955 at the site that would become the Mir Mine. The discovery was made by two geologists, Yuri Kabardin and Ekaterina Ilagina, who had been searching for months through the taiga and found a crucial clue in a peculiar place: the blue clay disturbed by a fox digging its burrow. The fox, looking for a den, had scratched through the kimberlite-bearing earth. The geologists, trained to recognize what blue kimberlite clay looked like, understood immediately what they were looking at. They sent a telegram to Moscow with the prearranged code phrase for a significant diamond discovery. "We have lit the pipe of peace." The state did not wait long before responding. Within a few years, the city of Mirny had been established. The Mir mine was in operation. The conditions were almost comically hostile. 7 months of winter, permafrost that had to be blasted with jet engines to excavate, temperatures at which steel became brittle and oil congealed. But the Soviet state's ability to deploy resources and labor without excessive concern for working conditions meant that production began regardless. At its peak in the 1960s, the Mir mine was producing 10 million carats of diamonds annually, of which 20% were gem quality. This was an enormous amount. The Soviet Union, through this and other Yakutian mines, became a major player in the global diamond market in ways that the diamond industry at the time found somewhat alarming. The dominant diamond cartel, De Beers, entered into quiet arrangements with the Soviet Union to regulate the supply and prevent Yakutian diamonds from flooding the market and depressing prices. Diamonds are, in the end, only as valuable as the story you tell about their scarcity. Today, the mining is done by Alrosa, the Russian diamond company that emerged from the Soviet industry. It's partially state-owned, partially held by the regional government of Yakutia, and it employs a significant portion of the population in diamond-producing areas. The city of Mirny, population around 35,000, exists almost entirely because of the diamonds. The company is the economy. Mining diamonds in permafrost involves a specific set of challenges that don't exist in warmer climates. The ground itself resists excavation. In winter, explosives are required to break through rock that would be merely hard in summer, but is essentially reinforced by the cold. The temperature inside deep mines can drop to -55 in winter. Machinery has to be specifically designed or modified for these conditions. The maintenance of equipment in such cold is a constant, expensive task. The open pit Mir mine is now closed and famously flooded. In 2017, water broke through the bottom of the pit, killing 8 workers and ending extraction. The pit itself remains, a vast, spiraling wound in the permafrost, visible from the air. There are plans to reopen the deposit as an underground mine at some point, but the engineering challenges are considerable. Underground mining in Yakutia creates its own interesting physics. Permafrost is, in a sense, a natural refrigerant. The underground rock stays frozen at ambient cold temperatures, which eliminates some of the ventilation and cooling challenges that underground mines in hot climates have. But it creates others. The rock itself must be managed carefully. Too much heat from equipment or personnel can cause localized thawing that destabilizes the mine walls. The thermal management of an underground mine in permafrost is its own specialized engineering discipline. The diamonds extracted from Yakutia are transported on what the company describes as secret flights, charter aircraft with undisclosed routing, carrying the rough stones to processing centers in Moscow and Smolensk before they're sold to cutters and polishers around the world. In each ton of ground excavated from a Yakutian diamond mine, there are roughly 6 carats of diamonds. 6 carats per ton. To make a single engagement ring diamond of meaningful size, you need a lot of tons. Economic significance of diamond mining to the Sakha Republic is difficult to overstate. Alrosa contributes around 40% of the budget of the Mirny district. The regional governments share ownership of the company, means that diamond revenues flow in part to local coffers. Yakutia, historically one of the most remote and economically marginalized regions of Russia, has managed, thanks to its minerals, to maintain per capita incomes that compare reasonably with national averages. But the relationship between mining and the traditional life of the indigenous peoples of Yakutia is not simple. The large-scale extraction of minerals from the land disrupts landscapes, affects rivers, and threatens the traditional economies of communities that depend on hunting, fishing, and reindeer herding. Several of Alrosa's operations have been associated with environmental damage, notably a dam failure on the Vilyui River that contaminated drinking water for riverside communities. The balance between industrial extraction and the rights and livelihoods of indigenous peoples is a live tension in Yakutia, as it is in extractive regions around the world. There's a particular poignancy to the diamond story when you set it against the history of Yakutia. The Gulag prisoners who built the Road of Bones were mining gold. The diamonds beneath their feet, and sometimes literally beneath the road they were building, would not be discovered for another decade or two. They died on land that was, in a sense, worth more than even their tormentors understood. The permafrost that killed them was also a vault. The physics of building on nothing, we've touched on permafrost engineering before, but let's slow down and spend some time here, because it's one of the more genuinely interesting chapters in the story of how humans have managed to build a functional modern city on top of frozen ground. Yakutsk is the largest city in the world built on continuous permafrost. This is not a small distinction. The permafrost beneath Yakutsk is not the intermittent, seasonally variable kind found at the margins of the permafrost zone. It is deep, stable, and, or rather, was permanent. In some locations beneath the city, the permafrost extends more than a kilometer down. Building on permafrost requires you to solve a problem that doesn't exist anywhere else. How do you construct something without the heat it generates melting the ground it's standing on? In warmer climates, this isn't a concern. Buildings sit on foundations dug into soil, and the interaction between building warmth and ground temperature is minimal. In Yakutsk, the ground beneath a building is a frozen solid, and if that solid thaws, the ground becomes an unstable slurry that has no capacity to support the weight of the structure above it. The Soviets, to their credit, understood this problem early and developed solutions that remain in use today. The primary solution, buildings on concrete piles, was developed in Yakutsk during the Soviet period and has been refined over subsequent decades. The piles are driven deep into the permafrost, sometimes to depths of 10 or 12 meters. The building sits on top of these piles, elevated off the ground by varying amounts, from 0.5 meter to 2 meters typically, with with an air gap between the building floor and the earth. The air gap is the critical element. It allows cold outside air to circulate freely beneath the building in winter, cooling the ground beneath the piles and preventing any heat from the building from reaching the permafrost. The piles themselves are embedded deeply enough that even if the surface permafrost is slightly affected, the structural support comes from deeper, colder, more stable ground. It works. Yakutsk has buildings that have been standing on this system for 60 or 70 years without significant problems, provided the system is maintained and the ventilation beneath the building is kept clear. Problems arise when maintenance is neglected, or when buildings are placed without proper survey work, or when warming temperatures push the permafrost in directions that the original engineering didn't account for. Walk through Yakutsk today, and you can see buildings that have begun to lean, or whose pile foundations are visibly compromised. The street-level view of some parts of the city includes structures that tilt at angles that would constitute emergency demolition notices in most places. In Yakutsk, they're part of the landscape. The question of what happens to Yakutsk as climate change continues to warm the region is one that engineers and city planners there think about a great deal. The passive ventilation system under buildings that keeps the permafrost frozen depends on winter temperatures being cold enough to cool the ground through the air gap. As winter temperatures rise, this passive cooling becomes less effective. Some buildings are now being retrofitted with active cooling systems, essentially refrigeration pipes embedded in the ground around the foundations, artificially maintaining the permafrost temperature. It works, but it's expensive, and it requires the electricity system to keep functioning indefinitely. Beyond individual buildings, the infrastructure of the city faces challenges from permafrost change. The above-ground pipe system is designed for specific thermal conditions. As those conditions shift, the insulation calculations that keep the pipes functioning may need to be revised. Roads built on permafrost are already problematic. They require constant maintenance as the freeze-thaw cycle creates new subsidence and heaving every year. If the permafrost becomes less stable, road maintenance becomes even more complex and expensive. There's a phrase sometimes used by engineers working in Yakutsk: "We live by the freeze." The permanent freeze is the foundation of everything, quite literally the ground on which the city stands. Its stability is not just an engineering concern, it's an existential one. Outside the city, in the tundra and the river valleys, permafrost thaw creates landscapes that look, honestly, a little like something going wrong. Thermokarst, the pits and hummocks and collapsed depressions that form when permafrost thaws unevenly, creates a rolling, irregular terrain that looks as though the ground is slowly melting, which it is. Lakes form in thermokarst depressions. Trees that were rooted in stable permafrost tilt and fall as the ground beneath them softens. These drunken forests, as they're sometimes called, have a haunting quality. Rows of conifers all angled in different directions, as though knocked sideways by some invisible force. And in the rivers and coastal areas, permafrost thaw is causing erosion at rates that alarm geologists. Banks that were frozen solid are slumping into rivers as the ice cement holding them together melts. Villages built on riverbanks are finding themselves closer and closer to the water's edge as the land retreats. Some communities have already been relocated. Others are scheduled for relocation. The cold, which once held the landscape in rigid stasis, is releasing its grip in places, and the landscape is in motion. The numbers that don't add up, life expectancy, population, and staying here, is something that requires a moment to sit with. People who were born in Yakutia, who have the theoretical ability to leave, often stay. More than that, some who leave come back. Some who had every reason to go somewhere warmer, somewhere easier, somewhere where the ground doesn't try to kill you 7 months out of the year. They go, and they miss it, and they return. This is not unique to Yakutia. It's a feature of extreme place cultures around the world. People who grow up in the deep desert, or on remote islands, or in the high Arctic, often have a relationship with their landscape that isn't well captured by words like preference or attachment. It's something more structural, an orientation of the self toward a specific environment that makes other environments feel wrong in ways that are hard to articulate. Yakutia has been losing population since the Soviet collapse of 1991. The economic supports that had made Arctic living viable for large numbers of people, the subsidized prices, the hazard pay, the state-backed industries, the guaranteed employment, disappeared or diminished. The cost of living in extreme cold is genuinely high. More energy, more food, more maintenance, more everything. Without the Soviet cushion, many people who had been sent to Yakutia by the state's workforce allocation system simply went home. The villages along the Kolyma Highway have lost 2/3 or more of their populations in some cases. Towns that had 10,000 people in 1980 now have a few hundred. Ghost towns, abandoned apartment blocks, empty streets, rusted infrastructure reclaimed slowly by the cold, are a feature of the post-Soviet Yakutian landscape. But the indigenous Saka people have remained in large proportions. The Saka Republic's population, which bottomed out in the years immediately following the Soviet collapse, has stabilized and in recent years grown modestly. The Saka people themselves constitute about half the population of the Republic, a higher percentage than at almost any point since Russian colonization began. Their language is being spoken by younger generations at meaningful rates. Their cultural institutions are active and increasingly well-resourced. There's a resilience here that deserves acknowledgement. Saka people have survived Imperial Russian colonization, Soviet collectivization and suppression, economic collapse, climate change, and 5 centuries of living in a place that many outsiders find incomprehensible as a choice. They are still there. Their language is still spoken. Their stories are still told. Their boots are still made from reindeer skin. Their fish is still eaten frozen. Their horses still stand in the snow outside hitching posts that our world trees. This persistence is not accidental. It is the product of exactly the qualities that allowed the Saka people to transform from steppe herders to Arctic inhabitants in the first place. Flexibility, intelligence, deep observational attention to the environment, and the willingness to incorporate new knowledge without abandoning what works. The Yakutian horse, grazing through 4 feet of snow to find the grass beneath, provides a useful image. The horse doesn't complain about the snow. It doesn't wish it were somewhere with better pasture. It is constitutionally adapted to finding what it needs in the conditions that exist, and it does so quietly and completely. The Saka people have, over centuries, done something similar, not through any biological adaptation, but through the accumulated intelligence of a culture that has paid very close attention to a very demanding world. Ice roads, summer floods, and the rhythm of an extreme year life in Yakutia is not uniformly cold. This bears repeating, because it's easy when talking about a place famous for -70 to forget that the same place regularly sees +30 in July. The annual temperature range in Yakutia is one of the largest of any inhabited place on Earth. Over 100 degrees Celsius from the coldest to the warmest recorded temperatures. This creates a rhythm of life that swings between extremes with a regularity that shapes everything. Winter in Yakutia begins in October and doesn't end until April or May. That's 7 months. 7 months of temperatures consistently below freezing, with the deep cold of January and February at the center. During this period, the Lena River, one of the great rivers of the world, hundreds of kilometers wide at some points, freezes solid. Ice roads form on its surface. Supply trucks use the frozen river as a highway. Communities that in summer are accessible only by boat or air become connected by these ice roads, which are maintained and marked like regular roads, with signs indicating safe routes and maximum load limits. The ice roads are a critical logistical lifeline for many communities. During the brief shoulder seasons, when the river is partially frozen but not safely crossable, some villages are essentially cut off. Too much ice for boats, too little for vehicles. These periods of isolation can last weeks, and communities plan their supply stores around them. In late April and early May, the Lena River breaks up. This is one of the great dramatic spectacles of the Yakutian year. The ice, which has been building up for months and can be a meter or more thick, begins to crack and heave. The sound carries for kilometers, a deep, structural groaning and popping that locals describe as the river waking up. Then the flows begin to move, carried by the current that was flowing beneath them all winter. Huge blocks of ice, some the size of houses, grind and jostle, and pile up against bridges and banks. The spring ice breakup causes regular flooding in low-lying areas. Yakutsk itself is vulnerable. The Lena, when it breaks up, can rise dramatically and quickly, and the ice jams that form when flows pile up can back the water over wide areas. Ice flood protection is a serious engineering and emergency management concern, and residents in low-lying districts keep alert in April and May in ways that don't apply the rest of the year. After the breakup, summer arrives with what feels, after 7 months of cold, like a kind of explosion. The sun is up for 18 or 20 hours. The temperature rises rapidly. Tundra and the taiga green up quickly in the long summer days, and the landscape that was white and featureless becomes almost aggressively alive. Wildflowers bloom. Mosquitoes emerge in quantities that those who haven't experienced a Siberian summer find difficult to believe. Thick clouds of insects, in the marshy tundra in particular, that require constant protection. The Lena River, free of ice, becomes a transportation network again. Boats carry passengers and cargo to riverside settlements. The annual Oymyakon festival brings people together to celebrate in ways that the cold months don't permit. Children who have been largely indoors for months play outside until 10 or 11 at night in the long summer twilight. Fishermen put out lines and nets in rivers and lakes that are suddenly rich with fish moving upstream. There's a quality to the Yakutian summer that people who have experienced it describe with unusual intensity, as though the concentration of light and warmth and life into such a brief period makes it more vivid than summer in places where it lasts all year. The strawberries are intensely sweet because the growing season is so compressed. The birch forests glow an almost electric green. The sky is huge and clear and blue for days at a time. And then August comes, and the evenings begin to cool, and the first frost appears on the grass in the morning, and the people of Yakutia begin again the ancient work of preparing for winter. Firewood, preserved food, the maintenance of heating systems, the inspection of winter clothing for wear and damage, the restocking of supplies, the closing up of summer structures, and the preparation of winter ones. It's not frantic. There's nothing frantic about Yakutian culture. Frantic is a luxury of places where the stakes are lower, but it's thorough and systematic, because being anything less than thorough would be dangerous. The rhythm is deeply internalized by everyone who has grown up with it. Ask a Yakutian child what October means, and the answer isn't a month, it's a checklist. The firewood should be in. The fishing should be done for the year. The winter clothes should be checked and repaired. The car engine should have its winter oil. The preparations should be made because the cold is coming, and the cold does not wait. Sakhawood and the future of the coldest place. There's a film industry in Yakutsk. This is not something most people know. It's small by Hollywood or Bollywood standards, but it's genuine, it's growing, and it produces films that have attracted international attention and festival success in ways that nothing from this part of the world did 20 years ago. The films coming out of Yakutsk deal with the specific reality of Yakutian life, with the cold, with the landscape, with the stories and spirits of the Sakha tradition, with the tension between tradition and modernity, with isolation and community, and the particular psychology of people who live in extreme places. There's a horror tradition in Yakutian cinema that makes a kind of perfect sense when your actual landscape is the kind of place where spirits have always been understood to inhabit mountains and rivers, and the cold itself, when your ancestral spiritual tradition involves elaborate relationships with forces that could kill you, when your physical environment is genuinely and consistently threatening in ways that most film audiences in temperate climates experience only in genre fiction. Horror is not an imported genre. It's a natural expression. The films are shot in conditions that would be genuinely challenging for any production team not from there. Cameras have to be kept warm. Battery life for equipment is a constant concern. Actors wear layers between takes and remove them only for the shots themselves. The landscape that appears in these films is not constructed or simulated. It's real. The cold is real. The ice is real. The blue-white light of a Yakutian winter day, the specific quality of shadow on snow, the way frost forms on everything, these are not effects. They're the weather. The emergence of sakkawood is a cultural statement as much as an industry. It says, in effect, we have stories worth telling. Our world, this extreme, demanding, beautiful, historically scarred world, is worth putting on film. People somewhere in the world will watch and be moved by what happens here. And people are. Yakutian films have shown at festivals in Berlin and Cannes and across Asia. Directors from Yakutsk have built international reputations. The film industry is, quietly, one of the most convincing arguments that the culture of Yakutia is not in decline. The future of Yakutia is complicated. The mineral wealth, diamonds, gold, coal, natural gas, is enormous and will continue to drive the regional economy for decades. The environmental consequences of that extraction, including permafrost thaw and river contamination, are real and growing. The tension between industrial development and indigenous land rights is unresolved. Climate change is remaking the landscape in ways that the engineering of the past century is not fully equipped to handle. The population of the Sakha Republic is slightly over 1 million. Of those, the Sakha people make up just over half. The other half includes Russians, Ukrainians, and members of several other smaller indigenous groups. The Evenks, the Evens, the Yukagirs, the Dolgans, each with their own languages and traditions and claims on the landscape. The Republic is, in a sense, a patchwork of claims and adaptations, all of them oriented around the same fundamental fact: the cold. And the cold, it turns out, is changing. Not enough to make Yakutia comfortable, not in any time frame relevant to anyone alive today. The warmest July on record at Oymyakon was still an average of 19 degrees. Yakutsk in January still averages minus 37. The winters are still long and dark and genuinely lethal to the unprepared. But the margins are shifting. The permafrost is less stable than it was. The river flooding is worse than it used to be. The fire season in the Yakutian taiga is longer and more intense because warmer, drier conditions make the forest more susceptible to burning. The relationship between the people of Yakutia and their environment, which has been calibrated over centuries of specific and demanding experience, is being required to recalibrate. The people of Yakutia will recalibrate. They've done it before. They did it when the Mongols pushed the Proto-Saka north, out of the steppe into the taiga. They did it when the Cossacks arrived with their guns and their fur demands. They did it during the Soviet period, when their entire social structure was reorganized by people who largely didn't understand it and didn't care. They did it after 1991, when the economic basis of their world was pulled out from under them. They are still there. The language is still spoken. The komis is still played. The stroganina is still eaten, thin slices of frozen fish, in the cold air of the outdoor market, in a city built on stilts over ancient ice. Breathing in cold air, the medical and scientific frontier, the extreme cold of Yakutia, is not only a challenge to be survived, it's also a scientific resource. Researchers from around the world come to study what happens to the human body, to ecosystems, to engineering, to permafrost, to prehistoric biology. When temperatures reach the extremes that Yakutia routinely produces. The Permafrost Institute in Yakutsk is a world-leading research center for the study of permafrost, its distribution, its behavior under changing conditions, its ecological role. Scientists there have been tracking the permafrost for decades, building a data record that is invaluable for understanding what is happening to the frozen north as the climate changes. Their boreholes go deep into the earth. Their temperature records go back further than almost anywhere else. They know with great specificity what's changing, where, and how fast. The Institute also operates a remarkable and somewhat whimsical attraction, the Permafrost Kingdom, a tourism site carved directly into the permafrost hillside. Tunnels dug into the frozen ground, maintained at temperatures between -7 and -20, filled with ice sculptures. Visitors are given thermal coats and felt boots at the entrance. Inside, there are sculptures of Yakut gods, of mammoths, of Santa Claus, of a horse frozen in mid-gallop. There's an ice bar serving stroganina and vodka in carved ice glasses. There's an ice slide. The origin of the Permafrost Kingdom is itself a piece of Yakutian practical history. The tunnels were originally dug as food storage. The permafrost maintains a constant temperature year-round, cold enough to preserve anything. Before modern refrigeration reached Yakutsk, the permafrost was the refrigerator. Businesses and households dug storage chambers into the frozen hillsides and kept their supplies there. The principle is the same as the outdoor market, where fish stand upright in the winter air. The cold that makes life difficult is also, consistently, the thing that solves the problems the cold creates. The adaptation of living organisms to extreme cold is a research area of genuine scientific importance, and Yakutia is one of the world's great natural laboratories for it. The Yakutian horse's physiological adaptations to cold, the double-layered coat, the compact body, the wide hooves, are studied by zoologists. The bacteria and microorganisms that survive in the permafrost are of interest to astrobiologists, who are looking for analogs to conditions that might exist on other planets. If life can survive in frozen, nutrient-poor, oxygen-limited permafrost, then life elsewhere in the solar system, on Mars, on Europa, becomes more thinkable. The human body itself is a research subject. Scientists have studied Saka and other indigenous Yakutian people to understand what, if any, physiological adaptations have developed through generations of cold exposure. The results: